Hi everyone, this is part one of a three-part video series that will act as an introduction to creating a balcony wildlife habitat. First things first, a little bit about me. My name is Terry Liu, and I'm currently a graduate student focused on urban ecology and community engagement within conservation. I've been an avid naturalist my whole life, and I strive to help people connect to nature in ways that are impactful and sustainable. Recently, I moved to Seattle and became a habitat steward through the National Wildlife Federation. And there I learned that it was actually possible to certify my teeny tiny balcony as a wildlife habitat. I wanted to encourage others to take the same action, and that's what this video series is all about. I want you to start in creating your balcony with inquiry. So spend some time observing your space, as each balcony is going to have its own little microclimate. So ask your questions like, what types of wildlife are you hoping to attract? What wildlife is already around? Are there specific restrictions on my balcony space? Weight limits, HOA regulations? Look at the lighting. How much do you get? How long do you have it? What is the temperature like on your balcony? You're going to want to take into consideration your water. Where is it going to be dripping and draining to? How are you going to get it? How are you transporting it? Think about wind factors. Are your planters going to be stable? How are you going to secure items to your balcony to prevent them from blowing away? By asking these questions, it'll kind of help decide or guide your decisions through your habitat creation process. And on top of that, by gathering this information before you go out and buy your plants and your materials, you're going to make the most informed decisions, and you can ask for more help from experts along the way. So let's do a little bit of practice. Here is my balcony. Balcony. My HOA is pretty harsh with its restrictions. So one of the biggest factors for me is that I am not allowed to drill any holes in the walls or ceiling. So anything that I want to hang, I have to have a separate stand for. Another factor for me is that I cannot place anything directly on top of or in front of that air conditioning unit, with the exception of apparently a beverage like there is in this picture. But I wanted to make sure I captured the little hummingbird in the corner. One of the other considerations for my space is that once that big leaf maple out front actually leaves out and becomes fully awake, I get almost no direct sunlight on my balcony. So any plants that I place in my space are going to be shade-friendly plants. If they need a lot of sunlight, they're not going to thrive in my environment. And I only want plants that thrive in my space. So I'm going to stick with shade-friendly plants for me. But each space is going to be different. So make sure you spend some time observing and inquiring about your own space so that you can find what's best suited for each environment. With that kind of taken care of, let's look at what it actually takes to become a certified wildlife habitat. So according to the National Wildlife Federation, you need 5 different factors. So you need 3 sources of food, 1 source of water, 2 sources of cover or shelter, 2 places where wildlife can raise and support their young. And then underlying all of that, you need to be cultivating sustainable and environmentally conscious practices throughout the creation of your wildlife habitat. We're going to go into each of these a little bit more in detail. So starting with food, the most beautiful and simplest way for you to add food to your balcony habitat is to plant flowers. Pollen and nectar from those flowers are going to attract both pollinating insects like butterflies and bees, but also hummingbirds and even bats. Nuts, fruits, and seeds are another great option for wildlife, but be cautious with these ones as you might attract unwanted wildlife such as ants or rats. That's for sure one way to really upset your HOA is if you're starting to attract rats with your wildlife habitat. So just make sure that you're keeping up with maintenance, keeping things tidy, and not letting anybody that you don't want on your balcony stick around too long. Also, by attracting pollinators with our flowers, we're going to be providing a food source for insect and bug-eating birds and bats. This picture here is of a wavy-lined emerald moth. It's a local favorite for bats. It also lays its eggs, and its caterpillars thrive on yarrow plants. So if you have a lot of caterpillars, those are great sources of protein for chickadees and juncos. So those all act as a food source. On top of these kind of more natural options, you can always add supplemental feeders to your balcony habitats. These are especially helpful for our local hummingbird species that are here year round. A lot of them will not have access to flowers in the winter months, so having these supplemental hummingbird feeders are a huge benefit and keep them supported throughout multiple seasons. Make sure, though, when you have supplemental feeders that you are keeping them full and clean. Unmanaged filters can grow mold and spread illness to your wildlife, which is the opposite of what we want. So make sure that you're keeping up with maintenance. For my space, I will dump out any nectar and rinse my feeders with vinegar water at least once a week. And during the summer, I'll do it twice a week because they can get pretty nasty. Water requirements can be a little bit more tricky in balcony habitats, but that does not make it impossible. So bird baths are a great place to start. One thing to consider, though, is when those birds are doing their little happy dances in the water, they tend to make a mess. So be mindful of where that water is going. If it's just going to be sitting around, what is it going to be kind of doing afterwards? So just something to keep in mind. If you would rather not have to be so mindful about things, a puddling dish is a great alternative option. A puddling dish is just going to be a dish that you fill with pebbles and rocks and then cover almost to the top with water. And this acts as a way for pollinators to get hydrated without fearing drowning like they would in a bird bath. The rocks and pebbles kind of act as like an escape route from the water. So that's a super great option for balcony habitats. And then another really positive option would be a small water fountain. These are especially great for bats if you can get airborne water, as bats are flyby drinkers. They don't want to actually have to stop to get a drink of water. So if you can have something in the air for them, you're going to be able to draw more in. Also, the sound of trickling water is going to pull more wildlife into your balcony. So if you're looking for a greater diversity of wildlife, having an auditory fountain can be a huge bonus. All right, cover and shelter requirements. So this is arguably the hardest part that we need to consider on our balconies. But again, not impossible. One thing to keep in mind is that while humans may be concerned with property lines and ownership rights, wildlife don't really care. So even though that big leaf maple tree is not on my balcony, it's right outside it and can still act as a source of cover for my balcony habitat. My chickadees and juncos love it out there. Other options include bird houses and bat boxes. Again, I can't have any on my balcony due to my HOA regulations, and they tend to be a little messy, admittedly. But if you're able and willing to keep up with maintenance, they are great options to have. And then another option for kind of our pollinators, insects, arachnids, that sort of thing, are just broad-leafed plants. Ferns are a great option up in here in Washington, but they just provide kind of a safe place for those insects and arachnids to hide, and also avoid the rain up here in Seattle. And finally, for our last kind of physical option, places to raise young. So a lot of these places kind of double as cover options. So bird houses and bat boxes, those count as both, right? You can have a nest of chicks as a place to raise young, and it counts as a source of cover for the parents. So think about that as you're kind of going through your wildlife checklist, if you will. Another great option is native host plants for caterpillars. So most folks know that monarch butterflies will only lay their eggs and their caterpillars will only eat milkweed plants. So we're going to want to have kind of those host plants as part of our habitats. And then we get caterpillars, which sometimes can be controversial. They will eat your crops, but that's also going to draw in those birds. Like I said earlier, they act as a solid food source. And then another really cool option that we have available is you can rent a mason bee house. You can just have a bee house, but there's also a program up here in Washington that allows you to rent these mason bees. You'll release them out into the wilderness, and then they will come back, lay their larvae in this mason bee house, and then you can actually send that back to Rent Mason Bees. They will take care of the larvae, make sure there's no disease or anything, and then keep them safe through the winter. So they send them back out in the springtime, making it a sustainable ever-going process. All of that information is actually linked in the description below. So if you're interested in renting mason bees, please go ahead and check that out. Mason bees are also a great option because they are gentle. They're solitary bees and they don't actually have stingers. So if you're worried about getting stung or any of kind of the adverse effects of stinging bees, mason bees don't have that problem. So they're kind of a safer option. They can also pollinate up to 2,000 flowers a day, which is just incredible. So look into mason bee rental if you are so interested. All right, moving on to some underlying sustainable practices that we can use on our balcony habitats. So utilize organic soil, compost, and fertilizer. Organic, organic, organic. We don't want any unknown pesticides, chemicals, who knows what in our soils. So stick with organic. I'll talk a little bit more about that in video 2, but overall, just stick with the organic stuff. You also want to avoid any pesticides on your balcony, especially if you're trying to attract pollinators. There are enough pesticides out there that they're trying to battle. We don't want those in our habitats. And again, the birds, the bats, other insect species, those are going to take care of our pests. We don't need additional chemicals to do that for us. We want to be intentional with our water usage. We don't want to just be dumping it out and having it spill anywhere. Be very conscious of how much water you're using. You can also get creative with recycled materials. So these 2 pictures here, this is an old wine bottle that I made into a hummingbird feeder. You can get those little plugs with the spout on it. I just got mine online, and then used twine to create the hanger. The other picture is just a paper towel roll, which you cover in peanut butter and then seeds. The chickadees, juncos, towhees, they'll go crazy for that stuff. Another option that you could consider is creating a compost barrel in your balcony space. This one is definitely going to require a little bit more research from you on the front end. They can get heavy, they can get stinky, so make sure that you do your research before you put a compost barrel on your space. They are incredible, a great way to get rid of food scraps, great sustainable tool. Just make sure that you are doing your research before you commit to that project. And then the last thing that I'll note here, and I will talk much more about this in video 2, is plant native plants. This is going to be one of the key practices that I enforce throughout these videos. Native plants are key in creating wildlife habitats. So as we are moving forward, I want you to try and operate from an ecocentric mindset. This is the idea that we as humans we are part of an ecosystem, not separate from it. If you're interested in looking into more specific information, in the description below, I've also linked the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife site and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Small Space Gardening Balcony Habitat website. Those are great resources to get further information. They also have a couple of resources linked within their websites. So make sure you go and check those out. Now that we kind of know what goes into having a wildlife habitat, we're going to go into how to create those habitats, container gardening, native plants, all of that good stuff in video 2. So thanks for coming to this one, and we'll see you there.